You left the door unlocked last night not by mistake, but by a quiet despair that wished someone would enter and finally not understand you. And yet no one came, only the wind brushing the curtains like a breath that knew too much. She had asked for honesty, but recoiled when you offered it without explanation. She had begged for connection, but wept when she could no longer map your soul. It wasn't cruelty that obsessed her, it was ambiguity. A mirror that reflected nothing back. The abyss she couldn't name. You became her unfinished prayer. There is no seduction in transparency, no faith in something that cannot betray. What draws her is not who you are, but what you withhold from even yourself. She doesn't want to know you. She wants to fail to know you. That's why she stayed. That's why she left. If this whisper already lives beneath your skin, if you've seen her eyes search for something even she feared to find, let it echo. Like the video, leave your shadow in the comments, subscribe, and stay near the silence. She does not want answers, she wants the ache of not knowing where your mind begins or ends. You never built walls, only corridors that circled back into themselves. She entered your world thinking there would be windows, explanations, maybe even an exit. But what she found was something worse. No angles, no edges, no outline to trace her fingers along. She walked through your words as if in a room without corners, where nothing could be pinned, nothing could be understood, and everything shifted the moment she looked directly at it. And that was what made her stay. Not clarity, not comfort, but vertigo. She asked about your past, and you answered with a riddle about silence. She asked how you felt, and you told her how shadows behave when no one is watching. You never lied. That was the worst part. You were never false. You were only ungraspable. And in a world that taught her to seduce, manipulate, and map every man like a room with numbered drawers, you became something unbearable, a void that would not be named. You didn't perform mystery. You simply didn't resolve. And that, to her, was the echo of the divine. Because she didn't want to understand you. Not truly. To understand is to contain. And no woman obsesses over what she already contains. She wanted to be held hostage by uncertainty, to see you with trembling hands and still not know what she held. Her femininity didn't crave control. It craved a man who made her feel lost in the presence of something not just masculine, but infinite. And you gave her that, not with charm, not with danger, but with the unbearable stillness of being unreadable. You weren't withholding. You simply didn't complete the sentence. And that silence, that aching, trembling silence became the altar she prayed at. Her friends told her you were emotionally unavailable. They called you a narcissist, a ghost, a walking contradiction. She nodded, pretending to agree. But deep down, she hated them for naming you. They couldn't see the sacred geometry of your unknowability. They didn't know what it meant to sit across from a man who didn't try to impress, didn't try to explain, didn't try to win. A man who simply was. You weren't safe, but you weren't dangerous either. You were untouchable, like fog. She could walk into you, breathe you, sleep inside your presence and still wake up unsure if you had ever really been there. And that doubt, that ache, became her secret obsession. She began to mistake your silence for depth, and maybe it was. Or maybe you, too, were lost. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she couldn't tell, and that made you God. You never revealed the shape of your wounds. You never offered her the kind of vulnerability she could nurse back to health. Because you weren't broken, you were formless. And nothing terrifies a woman more or pulls her deeper than a man who does not bleed on command. Because she has seen too many men cry too early, confess too loudly, perform pain to earn intimacy. But you let the silence rot. You let the tension grow. You let the question remain unanswered, and that became the rhythm of her breath. She asked you why you never opened up, and you asked her why she needed to feel useful. You never insulted her, but you unhinged her. She thought she was the deep one until she met someone who couldn't be excavated. She thought she would unlock you until the key she forged melted in her own hand. And somewhere between her 9th dream about you and her first fight with herself, she realized something unbearable. You never had a door. There was no center to storm, no final sentence, no declaration of love she could capture in screenshots and show her therapist. You offered her only this presence without definition, and that broke her far more than cruelty ever could. She thought she could live with not being understood. She never expected to be the one who couldn't understand. So she tried harder. She tried to provoke you. She played the old games: withdrawal, jealousy, coldness. But you didn't respond like a puzzle. You responded like a cliff, still, immovable, echoing with meanings you never confirmed. And that made her weep. Not because she was rejected, but because she was finally irrelevant to the one thing she couldn't name. Every story she had ever told herself about love involved comprehension. I just want someone who sees me. But here you were seeing everything, revealing nothing. And it tore at the seams of her identity, because if a man doesn't beg for understanding, doesn't explain his actions, doesn't seek to be known, then who is she in the room with him? No longer the interpreter, no longer the decoder, no longer the center of gravity. She tried to leave, of course, but absence changes nothing in a room with no corners. The silence stayed. The questions stayed. Her obsession stayed because it was never about you. It was about what you refused to give her a name for her experience. You left her with nothing to hold, and in doing so, gave her something eternal to want. She sits now in another man's arms. Perhaps someone safe, someone clear, someone open. But part of her is still circling your words like a moth around an invisible flame. Not because you loved her, not because you broke her, but because you were never finished, never explained, never known, never. And every woman fears the man she cannot explain, because in her deepest ache, she knows if he cannot be defined, he cannot be controlled. And if he cannot be controlled, then perhaps she is the story's real center. That is the pain she dares not speak, that you were never hers to understand, and that her desire was not for you, but for the mirror of her not knowing, not love, not lust, but vertigo. Her obsession grows when you become unreadable, not cold, not cruel, but uncapturable. You never gave her anything to hold, and still she tried to hold you, as if her hands could bend around fog, as if warmth could shape what would not stay. She stared into you like a mirror that refused to reflect, and in the absence of her own image, she began to dissolve. Not because you were cruel, but because you refused to offer clarity. You never distorted her. You simply didn't return her gaze. And that kind of emptiness is the cruelest kind, the emptiness that invites projection, the silence that listens too closely. You were not absent. You were present without confirmation, and in a world that feeds on labels, roles, and reciprocity, that made you monstrous. She kept testing the glass. She brought her laughter, her body, her past, her secrets. She pressed them all against you, waiting to see them echoed back, waiting to feel real in your eyes. But your eyes never aligned with hers. They hovered like mist. They shifted like dusk. You never looked through her, but you also never fully looked at her. And that awakened something deeper than insecurity. It awakened unbeing. You didn't make her question your feelings. You made her question her existence in your presence, because most men collapse beneath the weight of her beauty, her anger, her need, But you did not collapse. You did not mirror. You did not offer proof that she had impact. And so her obsession began not with desire, but with dread. The dread of being invisible to a man who should have broken. The dread of feeling nothing reflected back. The dread of wanting to scream and finding only stillness in return. You weren't unreadable because you played games. You were unreadable because you refused to perform legibility, and without a readable man, she became unreadable to herself. In most love stories, there is the lover and the beloved, the seeker and the sought. But you offered her neither role. You were the mirror that never showed her face, the sea that never gave back her voice. And in that refusal, she fell into something deeper than love madness. She began to listen for signs that weren't there. She watched your pauses. She dissected your tone. She replayed moments that had no hidden meaning, desperate to extract intention. Because you didn't reject her, you didn't abandon her, you simply stayed and remained undecoded. That's what drove her mad. Not your distance, your nearness untouched by interpretation. She started asking herself impossible questions. Why doesn't he open up? Why doesn't he react? What is he hiding? But what you were hiding wasn't a secret. It was your refusal to offer yourself as a mirror. You would not be her confirmation. You would not be her audience. You would not reflect her myth. And so she turned inward violently, obsessively, destructively, because in the absence of reflection, the self collapses. You became her silence. You became her doubt. You became her unanswered prayer, not because you vanished, but because you remained untranslatable. Other men were pages she had already read. They confessed too easily. They unraveled too soon. They gave her the satisfaction of knowing, and once she knew, she no longer wanted. But you never turned the page. You never let the story conclude. You never gave her the final word. And so she read you again, and again, and again. She tried to define you through others. She sought archetypes, warning labels, red flags. Maybe you were emotionally damaged. Maybe you were a narcissist. Maybe you were simply cruel. But none of those words fit. You weren't hostile. You weren't broken. You weren't closed. You were something far more unbearable. You were undefined, and in that undefined space, she projected everything. Her father's absence, her ex's betrayal, her fear of never being chosen, her longing to be seen as worthy. She filled the void with her pain, and you held the void open, like a wound that refused to close. Not because you enjoyed it, but because it was simply who you were. You didn't offer her safety. You didn't offer her destruction. You offered her limitlessness. And the feminine psyche, hungry for boundaries even in its chaos, could not stand it. She would rather be wounded by a man she understands than undone by a man she cannot define. Because once defined, pain has a name. Once mapped, longing has a root. But when the mirror shows nothing, the self begins to vanish. And that, to her, was worse than heartbreak. It was erasure. So she clung tighter, not because you gave her hope, but because you gave her nothing. And in that nothing, she created everything. You became the man she couldn't stop dreaming about. Not because you promised her the world, but because you never offered the illusion of one. Your presence was blank. Your words were pure. You never manipulated. You simply were not manipulatable. She began to believe there must be a code, a trauma, a wound, some hidden weakness she could touch to make you human. But every time she reached, you didn't resist. You just didn't yield. And so she wept, not from rejection, from misrecognition, Because to desire someone you can't define is to desire your own disappearance. And yet, she stayed, even in your absence, especially in your absence. Because obsession does not require presence, only ambiguity. She would sit alone in her apartment, rereading your last message, 3 sentences, neutral, gentle, impossible, and somehow infinite. She built entire worlds from those syllables, not because they meant anything, but because they meant nothing she could verify. And that, for her, was the source of all desire. Not pleasure, not promise, but the void between meanings. You weren't the man who wounded her. You were the man who refused to be interpreted. And in a world that demands interpretation, that made you unbearable. She still speaks of you, perhaps, not as a villain, not as a lover, but as a mirror that never gave her back her shape. She tells her friends you were strange, quiet, deep, maybe, or maybe just cruel. But in her silence, she still wonders, what did he see in me that he never said? And that question unanswered. Unanswerable is the thread she cannot untie. You are not her past. You are not her future. You are the question she asks every time she looks in a mirror and doesn't recognize her own face. Because the obsession was never about you. It was about what you refused to offer a reflection, and in your refusal, you revealed something she had never dared face. She does not exist without someone to define her. When she can no longer define you, she mourns and desires you more, because the undefined cannot die. She began to grieve you before she ever lost you. That's the first thing you need to know. The mourning did not begin with your silence. It began with your presence. The ache began the moment she realized she couldn't name the thing you were becoming in her life. You weren't a boyfriend. You weren't a soulmate. You weren't a mistake. You were something outside her entire vocabulary of romance, outside the categories she'd spent years perfecting. And so the grief was premature, ambiguous, without ceremony. The way one grieves a ghost they're still in love with. The way one buries a body they never found. She didn't cry when you left. She cried when she could no longer locate you. You had slipped past language, slipped past roles, slipped past anything she could blame or praise or even miss in the usual ways. Because when a man leaves her, she gets to rewrite the story. But when a man dissolves without form, without sin, without closure, she is left with nothing to resolve. And nothing to resolve becomes everything she revisits. That's the shape of obsession, not love, not lust, but the loop of unresolved meaning. You didn't break her heart, you stole her compass. You made the landscape of her own desire unrecognizable. You made her doubt that she was even built to understand what she wants, because she didn't want you until she couldn't finish the sentence. And once she couldn't finish it, she could never stop whispering it under her breath. It was not what you said. It was what you never clarified. It was the soft shrug, the silence after her question, the way you looked at her with the dignity of a man who did not owe her a conclusion. You were not cruel. You were complete in yourself. And for someone raised on the hunger of relationships, completeness in another feels like starvation. You were not a puzzle. You were a graveyard of puzzles pieces with no picture, and that image haunted her. So she grieved you in fragments, quietly, with confusion instead of eulogies. She imagined conversations that never happened. She wrote messages she never sent. She deleted your name, then typed it again. Her grief was not for what was lost, but for what was never defined enough to be lost. How do you bury someone who never made a promise? How do you forget someone who never gave you a memory that could be told straight? And so she kept you in the folds of uncertainty. She turned you into a myth, a shape with no face, a man who appeared in her dreams not as himself, but as an unfinished sentence walking through rain. Others came after you, of course, men who were clearer, kinder, sharper, but with every clear gesture, every labeled affection, every emotionally available smile, something inside her hardened. Not because they were lesser, but because they were understandable. And what is understandable can be outgrown. But you never expired because you never began. And that's what she mourned. Not a person, but a possibility with no form. A presence that refused to decay because it never belonged to time. And that's what makes your ghost so unbearable. It doesn't age, it doesn't die, it doesn't shift into bitterness or nostalgia. It just hovers, like a question asked in a language she forgot how to speak. You exist now in the corner of her thoughts she can't clean. The corner that smells like rain and unopened letters. The corner that holds the version of herself she once was, the version that couldn't decipher you but kept trying anyway. Because chasing the undefined gave her a sense of identity stronger than any love ever did. It made her feel alive, even as it made her feel insane. She doesn't tell people this. She tells them she's over it, that you were emotionally unavailable, that she learned, that she healed. But some nights, she dreams of you, not you exactly, but the shape of not knowing you, the ache of not having a definition to bury, the scent of grief with no corpse. And in those dreams, you never speak. You just look at her, like a mirror that never learned how to reflect, like a god that never needed worship to exist, like a man who disappeared without moving. She still tries to define the ache, but there are no names for what refuses death. You did not die in her life. You evaporated, and what evaporates cannot be mourned, only traced, only chased, only remembered in the humidity of absence. She thinks sometimes about messaging you, not to rekindle, not to clarify, just to check if you still remain undefined. But she doesn't, because she knows the message won't make you real. She knows you will not explain, you will not mirror, you will not complete the loop, and she cannot survive another taste of that. Because to speak to a man who will not be defined is to invite the death of self-definition, and she has worked too hard to rebuild the story you shattered by never entering it. You didn't steal her trust, you stole her fiction, and without fiction, desire has no place to land. So she turned her mourning into narrative. She told herself you were just a phase, a test, a trauma, something to outgrow. But at night, when her skin feels cold in places she never noticed before, she knows the truth. She never stopped wanting the man she couldn't hold, because wanting him never required holding. It required never knowing. And now she sees him in everyone, not you, but the space you left, the outline of a man that can't be drawn, the ache for a mirror that shows no face, the memory of a presence that refused to die because it never existed in the first place. This is the death that never finishes, the funeral that has no priest, the grief that cannot be spoken because there is no name on the tombstone. And that is the final cruelty. You are not the man she misses. You are the absence she worships, because only the undefined is eternal. There is a garden with no gates. Inside, a woman stands barefoot, whispering a name that never had a mouth. The trees bend away from her. The air forgets her. She holds a ring that was never offered, and slips it onto the finger of a man made of wind. He smiles and vanishes again, and still she waits.